Easy Polish with Dorota Cooper. Absolutely necessary Polish phrases to sound like a Polish native. How are you? Native speakers of English tend to see how are you as an indispensable phrase that every language learner should learn, preferably in the very first lesson. While this approach works great for many popular languages, it might not be so helpful when learning Polish. Let me explain. Polish does have a handful of phrases that can be translated as "How are you?" But in most contexts, they are treated somehow differently from what you are used to in English. This video will teach you how, but most of all, when to say how are you in Polish. When to say how are you in Polish. Coach notes. Before we start discussing specific phrases, there is one thing you absolutely need to know. Polish equivalents of how are you are not used too often in everyday conversations. If you want to speak natural Polish, you should learn to recognize the contexts where it is acceptable or expected to ask people how their day is going. Poles treat how are you very literally. When asked the question, they will often read it as an expression of genuine interest in their well-being and the events of their day, and not just a friendly greeting. If you are lucky, they will treat you to an extensive summary of their recent ordeals. If you are less fortunate, again, depending on how you look at it, they will respond with a single word and immediately change the topic. There are, however, some situations where starting conversation in Polish with a how are you is always appreciated. Some of the phrases described here work great when catching up with someone you haven't seen in a long time. Others are commonly used to express concern about someone's health or mental well-being. Another thing to keep in mind, almost all instances of how are you in Polish are informal. It's okay to use them with friends, family, or colleagues, but you should probably refrain from using them when talking to strangers or people you are in the professional relationship with. Most common ways to say how are you in Polish. If you believe you have a good reason to ask someone how they are, your safest bet will be to use one of the four phrases. Jak tam? Jak leci? This is a very casual way to ask someone about their well-being. Both phrases can be compared to how is it going in English. If you ask this question, you can expect to hear very short summary of the person's current mood. This means you can safely use it as a conversation starter. If your friend doesn't feel like talking about the details of their life, they can always brush you off with a quick dobrze, good, without feeling bad about it. Curiously enough, the literal translation of jak leci is how is it flying, which is probably why it is seen as the more colloquial of the two. Co słychać? Co tam? Though in tone they are similar to the two phrases described before, co tam and co słychać invites a longer reply. In principle, they are equivalent to what's up or what's new in English. Because of these connotations, the two phrases work great when you are catching up with a friend and would like to encourage them to tell you about what is been going on in their life. Both phrases also have longer versions that explicitly mention the addressee. If you are addressing a single person, you can say co tam u ciebie or co u ciebie słychać. Similarly, when speaking to a group, you can use co tam u was or co u was słychać. Additionally, you can make the greeting much more formal, but still friendly, by using the formal forms of address co u pana słychać when speaking to a man, co u pani słychać when speaking to a woman, or co u państwa słychać when speaking to a group. This is one of the few ways to gracefully ask someone, "How are you?" in a more formal context. Other ways to say "How are you?" in Polish. In addition to the above, there are two other closely related expressions that every learner should know, though not necessarily use a lot. Jak się czujesz? This phrase translates to how are you feeling and should only be used as such. Though in some contexts it can also be translated as how are you, it might be risky to remember it that way. More often than not, jak się czujesz is used to ask about someone's well-being. If you are talking to a Polish friend who has recently been unwell saying jak się czujesz will let you express your concern about their health. When addressing people who you are on less familiar terms with, it's much better to use the formal variants jak się pan czuje when speaking to a man, jak się pani czuje when speaking to a woman, and jak się państwo czują when speaking to a group. Jak się masz? In some phrase books, you might see this expression listed as the default equivalent of how are you in Polish. Do not fall for that. Jak się masz sounds very stilted, which is why hardly any Pole use it in everyday speech. While it is true that the phrase is one of the most literal translations of how are you into Polish, it does not necessarily mean that. It sounds good to the Polish ear. People who says jak się masz are mostly foreigners or Poles who just want to sound quirky. My advice to you is to avoid using the expression altogether and stick to jak tam or co słychać, which are much more natural. Typical responses to how are you in Polish? Dobrze, good. W porządku, all right. Tak sobie, so. Kiepsko, słabo, bad. To wszystko na dzisiaj. Do zobaczenia.